Hello, folks. I see we have some people going ahead and joining the webinar today. Thank you for joining us. This is part 2 in our invasive plants webinar series. We will get started in about 5 minutes. We want to give folks a chance to get logged into the webinar. Just a few quick housekeeping tips. The chat has been disabled for this webinar, so please type any questions that you have into the Q&A, and I will be monitoring that as we go throughout the webinar, answering those that I can and saving some that would be good for the group until the end. Again, this is the part 2 in our invasive species webinar series, and we will get started in about 5 minutes. Welcome, folks. If you're just joining us, this is the invasive plants in the home landscape, part 2 of our webinar series on invasive plants. We will get started in a few moments here. We want to give everyone a chance to log into the webinar. We have disabled the chat function for participants, but if you have a question, please do write it in the Q&A section and we will get to your question. I'll be monitoring that as we go along. We are recording this webinar and it will be available for viewing after the webinar has concluded. There was a question that came into the Q&A just now regarding the recordings and how you access them. As this is an on-demand webinar, since you have registered for the webinar, you should be able to click the link for the webinar that you received in your registration confirmation after the completion of the program. It takes a couple hours for the recording to be available, but you should be able to just click the link for that first webinar if you did attend it and register, and you should have access to that recording. If not, you can feel free to email me and I'll type my email into the chat so that you all have it. Otherwise, we will be posting the entire webinar series as a playlist on our YouTube channel, and that'll be here. The final part of the series is going to be next week, and so we'll have that webinar playlist up on our YouTube channel probably in a week or two. So you can feel free to check back there. And once we get started here, I'll share the link to our YouTube channel as well as the registration link for the third part in the series in the chat box. And again, thank you all for joining us today. It is 1 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. You should be here for the invasive plants in your home landscape. My name is Alyssa Vinson, and I am the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office. And I like to take an opportunity at the beginning of our webinars to just give a brief overview of what Extension is and who we are, what we do, because some of you have never joined us before for a program. If you have, welcome back. I'm happy to see you. We are a function of the land grant university system. And here in the state of Florida, we have two universities that participate in that system, and that's the University of Florida, as well as Florida Agricultural Mechanical University. And so our function as part of the University of Florida is to kind of translate the research that's conducted at the university as well as at other educational institutions throughout the world and bring it back to our communities in a way that is relevant and applicable to your everyday life. And our main mission is to make that knowledge accessible and enhance the quality of human life for the folks that live in our communities. And we do this in a number of different ways. You're here joining us for a webinar that's going to be delivered by one of our Master Gardener volunteers. We have the Master Gardener Volunteer Program is a statewide program. In our office, it's managed in the Residential Horticulture Department, of which I am the agent. We also have the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program in our department or in our program area. But within Extension in Manatee County, we have a marine resources agent who focuses on issues with commercial fishing and healthy shorelines. We have commercial livestock agents. We have folks that work with the agricultural industry for vegetable production as well as for the commercial nursery industry. We have folks who train professional landscapers. We have folks that work with schools and with groups of school children on nutrition programs as well as our very robust 4-H program. So we really do touch nearly every corner of life here in Manatee County, and I like to put up these impacts just so that you can see, you know, while sometimes Extension tends to fly under the radar, I think that we really do have a very wide-reaching impact on our community. And you can see, you know, millions of dollars in value of new licenses and CEUs for pesticide license holders, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in value of volunteer time. And that's really our Master Gardener volunteer program here in Manatee County annually donates over 10,000 hours of their time to provide educational opportunities to the public. We have over 28,000 youth educated through our 4-H program and 14 million gallons of water saved to Manatee County Utilities customers. And that's only the water that's saved specifically for individuals who have in-ground landscape irrigation. That's not even counting the gallons and of water that are saved through various types of landscape practices related to our Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. So we really do have a broad impact, and I'm happy that you've joined us today. And I am particularly happy to introduce Amy Stripe, who is one of our Master Gardener volunteers. She will be leading the presentation for you today on invasive plants in the home landscape. Remember, this is being recorded. It will be available. The chat function has been disabled, so please do go ahead and write your questions in the Q&A box, and I will try to answer some of those as we go along, kind of in the background. And then those questions that are relevant to the entire group, I'll go ahead and kind of hold those till the end, and we'll have Amy answer those at the end. All right? And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Amy take it away.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? This is, as Alyssa said, this is a part 2 or a 3-part series on invasives, and we're targeting really here the home landscape. So today we're going to be talking about some common invasives that are found in home landscapes and some Florida-friendly alternatives or substitutes for those particular plants. I have tried, not knowing how widespread my audience is in Florida, I have tried to pick a variety of invasive plants and substitutes for North, Central, and South Florida. So some of them may be more relevant to you than others, but hopefully you'll get the idea of how to go about figuring out what you need to do to get some of those invasives substituted for other alternative plants. It's about a 45-minute presentation today. And next week, we will be talking about, in part 3, we'll be talking about how to manage invasives in the home landscape. In other words, how to eradicate, usually, in the home landscape. So I do have a little housekeeping detail, or 2 little housekeeping details from last week's webinar. We did have a question that came up, and I frankly scrambled to answer it. And here was the question. Is elephant ear invasive? Well, what I was scrubbing about is because elephant ear is a common name that's used for a number of different types of plants. So I wanted to answer the question in full after having gone back and done some research on it. So my elephant here is confused because he knows that there's the elephant ear pastry, which is on the far left. I grew up in Latin America, and we used to eat these all the time. It's a very popular pastry. We call them orejas, ears, literally. But I know that here in America, it's called the elephant ear pastry. But there's a number of different types of plants that you see in that middle sort of thought balloon there that are called elephant ear. So basically, our elephant is kind of like those darn common names, right? There's just too many of them. So I went back and I looked at hold on, I just want to get rid of this panel here. There we go. I went back and looked at the University of Florida's assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas, and there were 3 examples of elephant ear common names in that database. And the first one was Colocasia macrorhizos, generally known as giant taro, but also elephant's ear. It is not a problem species in North, Central, or South Florida. And by the way, I'm going to just go over these terms again in a minute, just to remind everybody what they are. And then there's Colocasia esculenta, which is known as wild taro. Now that is an invasive, no uses under any circumstances in North, Central, and South Florida. And then our Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council does categorize that as a Category 1 invasive also throughout the state. And then the last one was Xanthosoma sagitifolium, which is arrowleaf elephant ear. Strangely, invasive no uses in Central Florida, but then there's kind of a division there between South and North Florida where it's just a caution. And I believe that's because it has been actually documented in Central Florida, and they're still doing the investigation for South and North Florida. But it's something you want to stay away from. In the FLEPC, the Florida Exotic Pest Plants Council, it's categorized as a 2, which is kind of a caution, I guess, to put it summarize it. Now, there's also elephant ears in the Colodium, genus. Now, you will run across things called Colodium esculentum and cultivars like Colodium esculentum, Colocasia, I mean, all sorts of confusing names. So, of course, I went to my go-to source, which is Mark Frank, our University of Florida extension botanist, and he pulled up a reference down here. This is a screen grab from Plants of the World Online, which is an excellent source. That's our go-to source for accepted scientific names. And you will see down here where it says Colodium esculentum is a synonym of Colocasia esculenta. So in other words, these are 2 completely separate genuses. So when you see Colodium esculentum, it is actually the Colocasia esculenta. I hope that that's clear. I did have to clear up also, thank you for the eagle-eyed Master Gardener who pointed out that Mark Frank is not in fact a PhD. I always introduce him as Dr. Mark Frank because in my mind he is. And when I shared that with him the other day, he said, well, I guess I'm an honorary degree holder from the Striped State University. So we had a good laugh about that. Just to remind you of some of the sources where we get our information on invasive plants, the Atlas of Florida Plants, that was our go-to source for nativity. This is a database of native plants as well as non-natives that have become naturalized. And that is our, like I said, our go-to source for nativity, whether it's a native or not. Then there is the FLEPSI list. They have a list, they maintain a list at which they update every 2 years of invasive plant species that have escaped cultivation. And then finally, the University of Florida's assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas. And just to remind you quickly, FLEPSI has 2 categories. Category 1, plants that are altering native plant communities. And category 2 are plants that are increasing in abundance or frequency, but not currently altering native plant communities. There are 3 regions of impact: North, Central, and South Florida. And then the University of Florida's, the way that they classify plants, the red lights are the not recommended. The yellow lights are ones that can be recommended, but you must make sure you manage them to prevent escape. And then the green lights are the ones that are okay to recommend. And again, they do also use North, Central, and South Florida. I used a couple of things for references today. These are a couple of, three publications that are really kind of good for more ideas that I'm going to give you today on alternatives to invasive plants commonly found in Florida landscapes. And there's a separate publication for North, Central, and South Florida. And you can access that. Take the lazy way out like I do. I go to Google, I put in UFL, EDIS. It takes me to the EDIS web or database or website, and then I put into the search engine what it is I'm looking for. So we're going to review 15 plants today, 15 commonly used invasive plants in our landscapes. And my main alternative selections for each one of these is really a native plant, because that's the best insurance you have against a non-native being somehow deemed risky or invasive at some point in time, which does happen. So, and my selection for alternatives is based on similar morphology, similar cultural needs, and so forth. So while it might not be quite obvious when you look at my alternatives, there's a lot of thinking behind it in terms of will this suitably thrive in the place in your landscape where you're removing an invasive. So alphabetical by scientific name, I will start with trees. We discussed the mimosa. It was an example that came up frequently in our last webinar. This is Albizia julibrissin. This is a native of Asia. It is deciduous in North and Central Florida. Quite brittle wood. This tree goes over in hurricanes quite easily. It is really not very long lived, maybe 20 years, maybe listed to be 20 years. Has a beautiful April to July bloom. It is so widespread outside of cultivation that a lot of people think that it's a native. But here's some alternatives to this particular tree. The eastern redbud, that is Cercis canadensis, that is a native. It is also deciduous, has a similar look in terms of the coloration. Alternative for North Florida, you'll see below right here, this eastern redbud. This is a non-native. But for North Florida is the red bottlebrush, Callistemon citrinus. Now, I have to caution you with the bottlebrush because there is the weeping bottlebrush, used to be called Callistemon viminalis. It has been reclassified as Melaleuca viminalis and is considered a high invasion risk throughout the state. So if you're going to opt for any of the bottle-brushes, make sure you get a species that is safe. In Central Florida, I picked the fringe tree as an alternative to mimosa. This is Chionanthus virginicus. It's an underutilized, beautiful native tree, has a beautiful blossom on it, and really makes a good substitute. Another non-native for Central Florida that you might consider is the red silk cotton tree, the Bombax ceiba. There used to be a beautiful one on the grounds of the old Bradenton Herald newspaper down there in downtown Bradenton, and it has since been leveled for apartments. It's a shame because it was a beautiful example of the Bombax ceiba. Here's the orchid tree. This is Bauhinia variegata. The orchid tree is native of Asia. Look at the seed pod on that on this puppy. It really does self-sow prolifically. Very fast growing. It is a deciduous tree. It is invasives, no uses in South Florida, a caution in Central Florida. On the Phlepsy list, it's category 1 invasive for Central and South Florida. It does bloom beautifully, though, I must say, in the spring. Alternatives for this tree, a native alternative is a sweet acacia. This is Acacia farnesiana. I have to say that it's got this really interesting, these interesting little blossoms. You don't want to plant this in a really heavily trafficked area in your yard. However, it has millions of tiny little thorns, but it is a beautiful native alternative to the orchid tree. If you want to consider for Central and South Florida a non-native alternative, guess what? There's another Bauhinia species there, the esculenta, that's the white orchid tree, that will do just fine. In South Florida, a good alternative to the orchid tree is the Jamaican dogwood, Pisidia piscupula. I can say that. You can tell by that scientific name, it somehow refers to fish. This is also called the fish poison tree because it was used in the Caribbean by indigenous people to, there's a toxic substance in there that they could use to stun fish so that they could actually catch them easily. But all parts of that, the Jamaican dogwood, by the way, are toxic or poisonous. Now, another non-native species for South Florida would be the Hong Kong orchid tree, which is Bauhinia x blakeiana. In fact, both of those alternative Bauhinias down there will do fine in Central and South Florida. Australian pine, introduced, of course, long favored as a beach erosion control measure and has escaped cultivation. The Australian pine trees, we discussed this last week, have this very dense and shallow root system, which makes it ideal for erosion control at the beach. But if you're kind of a sea turtle, not so great, because you can't really make a nest around that tree. You just can't get into it to dig a nest. So this is one of the many reasons why Australian pine is considered a prohibited species, I should say. And then in Phlepsy, it's considered a category 1 in North, Central, and South Florida. And by the way, it is not a true pine. But alternatives to Australian pine, if you want to go the conifer route, one of my favorite trees of all time is the southern red cedar for Central and South Florida. That's Juniperus virginiana, the variety is salicicola, a fast-growing, beautiful native tree. It is dioecious. It has another separate male and female plants. You can shape it like a Christmas tree, like the picture kind of in the middle there, or you can just let it do its own deal. It will limb itself up over time. It will, kind of shed some of those lower limbs, and it's a fantastic screening tree. Makes a great substitute to Australian pine. In Central and South Florida, also the slash pine is a great conifer, Pinus elioti. It actually beautiful, grows in a lot of different kinds of conditions, and will also limb itself up over time. So not a big maintenance issue. If you want to consider non-native, the arborvitae, Platyticus orientalis is also a beautiful tree that makes a good substitute to Australian pine. Camphor-tree, Cinnamomum camphora. This was introduced in 1875 for camphor production, and it turned out to be not too profitable. It's a native of Asia. Look at the leaf shape there. It's got a really interesting, pretty leaf shape. But unfortunately, it produces large amounts of seeds. It grows rapidly. The fruit stains like sidewalks, cars, you name it. It's like 40 to 50 feet high. It's a monster, 50 to 70 feet wide. And in fact, it is actually displacing the Florida jujube, which is Sisyphus salatus in some counties in the state. It is invasive in North and Central Florida, according to the assessment, caution in South Florida. Phlepsy says it's a category 1 throughout. Some good alternatives. In North and Central Florida, the Florida elm, Ulmus americana, variety of Floridana, has a very kind of similar filigree type looking leaf. Very pretty, very good ideas for a substitute for that camphor tree, multi-stemmed like many camphor trees are. Another alternative in Central and South Florida, is for Central and South Florida, I should say, is the native mahogany, Switenia mahagoni. This is where the mahogany wood comes from, and this particular tree has been poached in the wild here in Florida. So I encourage, whenever you have the room and if you're the right zone, if you're in the right USDA zone, to plant a mahogany tree, because they are absolutely spectacular trees, and they do survive a number of different growing conditions. For a non-native alternative, I have selected the Chinese elm, Ulmus parvifolia, very similar type, beautiful leaf shape, like the mahogany, like the Florida elm, much, much better than having a nasty camphor tree in your yard. All right, here's the carrotwood. We all know about this one, Cupaniopsis anacardiodes. This was introduced in 1968 as a beautiful shade tree for Florida yards. And it is a beautiful shade tree for Florida yards if it would just stop reproducing like crazy. The seeds get dispersed by birds. It pretty much really alters the understory underneath it, because it just shades out everything that could possibly grow underneath it. And it is tolerant of a wide range of soils. It grows in hammocks, scrublands, pinelands, loves urban settings, doesn't mind sitting on a busy street corner with, in a median. It survives all sorts of conditions, but it is a prohibited species in the state. And again, Schefflera categorizes in Central and South Florida as a Cat 1, but it is on the prohibited list. So that means that nobody's allowed to cultivate it in a commercial setting or sell it commercially. I can't tell you how many of these things I pull out of my yard on a weekly basis. I have a neighbor with one across the street from me, probably about 75 yards away, and I'm pulling this stuff up all the time. So good alternatives. The native red bay tree, this is Persea barbonia. This is a beautiful native tree. In fact, it is in the laurel family. So you can use its leaves as a substitute for bay laurel in cooking, for culinary uses. It is a fairly fast-growing tree, and it can be shaped beautifully. In Central and South Florida, again, I'm throwing the mahogany out in front of you, so you better get one. Another alternative, a non-native alternative, is the black olive shady lady, Terminalia bucerus. I must say, though, a caution there is that the shady lady is, according to the University of Florida assessment, a caution in South Florida. It's an interesting thing that this Terminalia bucerus used to be called Buceta bucerus. That used to be the genus. And if you go back and look at old sources of information, they classify this as a native. So I think there might still be something in play about that, but for the moment, it is considered non-native, and it is considered caution for South Florida. Here's our good old coconut palm, Cocos nucifera. So if you joined us last week, you know that relatively little is known about the origin of this species. It probably is from the South Pacific. As we discussed, the fruit can float for long distances in salt water and still germinate when it washes ashore. It grows in a wide variety of soils, and it's the most extensively grown and used nut in the world. And there are many cultivars of Cocos nucifera. Now, it is an invasive species in South Florida. That's how the University of Florida assessment classifies it. It's a caution species for Central Florida. Obviously, North Florida, it will not do well. It's outside of its comfortable climate range. Schefflera lists this as a category 2 in Central and South, which basically says, keep an eye on it. Now, there's not a lot of native substitutes for this particular palm. I have selected the royal palm that is a native, Roystonia regia, more for South Florida than Central and North. Obviously not North Florida, but it is definitely a warm weather palm. And the reason, and it gets a similar height to coconut palms. Over time, coconuts can get quite tall. And it does share something else in common with the coconut palm, which is the hazard of dropping things off that particular plant. In the case of the coconut, obviously the coconuts are a hazard, but in the case of the royal palm, it is a self-cleaner, which means that the fronds will die and then drop off of their own accord. And believe me, you do not want to be underneath that when that happens. That's kind of a hazard. That could weigh 30 to 40 pounds. In Central and South Florida, I selected the pindo palm. It is not a native. This is Butea odorata. I selected it because it's got kind of similar graceful fronds the way the coconut palm does, but it is a very underutilized palm. And in that regard, I think it would make a stunning, a stunning specimen in your landscape. In terms of other non-native species, for South Florida, the pica-bean palm, which is Arcota phoenix conanhaviana, would be a really good choice. Another non-native choice for Central and South Florida might be the wild date palm, that's Phoenix sylvestris. Here's the Australian umbrella tree, Schefflera actinophylla. I have a neighbor that has this in their yard, and I do have to say that that striking flower spike in the summer, as you can see in the picture on the right, is just really spectacular. But this guy can get massive, as high as 40 feet tall. It does reproduce readily. It is an invasive no usus for Central and South Florida, according to the university's assessment. Flepsy categorizes it as a Cat 1 for Central and South Florida, so not a good guy. Some alternatives: a native wild cinnamon, very underutilized, Cannella winterana. It gets to a similar height, believe it or not, as the Schefflera, and it does have a leaf shape that kind of resembles it, although on a much smaller scale. Another non-native for South Florida, non-native I should say for South Florida, would be the traveler's palm, Ravenella madagascariensis. I'm sorry, I have to back up. I went to the dermatologist yesterday, and you know how you go in and you go just for a checkup, and then they end up taking like 3 biopsies. So I'm on I think I'm on ibuprofen or something today, so I'm kind of skipping around here. That's my excuse. Anyway, so yeah, the traveler's palm. The traveler's palm has a very striking habit of growth. It is not actually a palm, by the way. It's in the more related to a bird of paradise, but it's a stunner. So similar to the actinophylla, it would make a statement in your landscape, and it's quite large. In Central Florida, the Cherokee bean is a great idea for a native substitute for that actinophylla. This gets this beautiful flower spike here, as you can see in the picture. This does not get as big as the actinophylla, but it certainly is a beautiful native. Now, I have to warn you also that this does have spines, and these are nasty spines on the Cherokee bean. So you want to, again, put it in a place where there's not a lot of foot traffic. Crepe myrtle is a good non-native in Central Florida substitute for actinophylla, in the sense that it does have a beautiful bloom. It can be very, very, very stunning, and it has a habit of growth that is, kind of different, and will stand out in your landscape. Here's the Chinese tallow tree. This is Triadica sebifera. This is a prohibited species by the university, or not university, I should say. This is a regulated plant, but it is prohibited. The Flepsy ranking is a Cat 1 in North, Central, and South Florida, so throughout the state. So this was introduced, believe it or not, in the 1700s, primarily for use as an ornamental, but also for making soap from the seed oil. It has become naturalized in pretty much the southern coastal plain, from South Carolina to all the way to Texas. It's over half the counties in Florida. It's naturalized. It's really a bad plant to have around. It is native to China and Japan, as it suggests, and the foliage does turn a beautiful reddish purple in the fall. They're also called popcorn trees because these little capsules, they burst open when they're ripe. So good alternatives. Again, in terms of North and Central Florida, a really pretty deciduous red maple, Acer rubrum, turns a beautiful red in the fall. So if you want that color in the fall that you get from your Chinese tallow, the red maple will get that for you. An alternative to a native for North and Central would be the chaste tree, Vitex agnus castus. This is a multi-trunked tree or shrub, has a beautiful purple kind of flower spike on it. quite stunning. In Central and South Florida, I selected the fiddlewood. It's not deciduous, but it does have a very, very pretty flower spike on it twice a year. It is a fast grower, has beautiful glossy green leaves, grows in a number of different growing conditions and soil conditions. I became a fan of it a couple of years ago when I picked up one at our plant fair. It was a tiny little 1 gallon, and I just plunked it in the yard. And it's done beautifully. It's just gotten huge over the last maybe 3 years. It's maybe 15 feet now, and it's wonderful. I'm a plant collector, by the way. I have sort of one of each. I'm not really landscape. Another alternative for Central and South Florida to Chinese tallow is, again, that crepe myrtle, that beautiful bloom, deciduous, and gives you that specimen type look in your yard. All right, we're going to skip now to a couple of more shrub type plants. So this is coral ardisia. This is Ardisia crenata, a prohibited species. And again, Flepsy does put it in Cat 1 throughout the state. It was introduced. It is now found in hammocks, grazing lands, wooded areas, gets up to 6 feet tall throughout the state. It's really hard to control this particular one. So some alternatives to it. There's in North and Central Florida, there's the native gallberry or inkberry, Ilex glabra, which puts on kind of a similar seed production. Beautiful leaf, similar to coral ardisia. In North and Central Florida, a non-native alternative might be the Chinese holly, which is Ilex cornuta. In South Florida, an alternative is wild coffee, Psychotria nervosa. Cannot say enough about this plant. All of these, by the way, like shadier conditions, including your coral ardisia. Your wild coffee will do really well in shade, has a wonderful white blossom that becomes, right about now, at least in Central Florida, it's turning into these red berries, and beautiful glossy leaf, just a gorgeous plant. Another native alternative for South Florida is the marlberry, Ardisia esculenoides. Marlberry is a plant that really prefers shadier conditions. It also produces a similar looking berry, although it's black. It has a white, really pretty white blossoms also. All right, here we go back to the elephant ear. I actually already had this in the presentation before the question came up, believe it or not, but yes, so this is Colocasia esculenta. University of Florida says invasive, no uses throughout the state. It is categorized as a Cat 1 in Flepsy throughout the state. And we've already talked a little bit about what happens with this guy. It's native to Asia. It invades waterways. They can get up to 4 feet tall. And again, don't want to confuse it with other commonly named elephant ears. One thing I don't know if I mentioned back when we were discussing the Colodium, Colocasia conundrum, is that there's no known, so far that I'm aware of, there's no Colodium that has escaped cultivation and has become a problem species outside, in natural areas. So the Colodiums are pretty safe, but this one, the Colocasia, is one to try to get rid of if you can. Alternatives to it are in North and Central Florida is that the swamp or golden canna flaccida. This is a really pretty plant. It has this really stunning yellow blossom on it. Gets to about maybe 3 feet tall, and it will self-sow, not aggressively sow, but it is really a nice thing to have in a wet area in your yard, which is where your wild taro is going to be growing as well. An alternative that is not a native for North and Central Florida would be shell ginger. That is not Ilex cornuta. I apologize. That is incorrect. Shell ginger that is not the correct scientific name. Apologize. In South Florida, the giant leather fern is a native. Now, this does get quite big. This gets maybe 6 feet tall, if not taller. Great for wet areas in your yard, and it is a stunner. I have to say, it's called leather fern because the backside of the leaves have this brownish kind of coloration on them that looks like leather, the color of leather. If you want another, actually another native alternative for South Florida would be, again, the marlberry. Similar growing conditions, wet, sometimes shadier conditions as well. Okay, here is bowstring hemp. This is Dracaena hyacinthioides. It used to be Sansevieria. That used to be the genus. All Sansevierias have now been reclassified as Dracaenas. And this is one particular bad species. Every time I look at this in a pot in somebody's office, I cringe. This was introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental as well as a fiber crop. It's a very common house plant. It does purify indoor air, so people really like that, you know, to have it. In fact, one of its sister species, the Trifasciata, was chosen as NASA's top houseplants for cleaning the indoor air in the space station. It absorbs toxins, you know, benzene and stuff like that. And then it produces pure oxygen, actually 24/7. But anyway, what happens with this particular guy is common house plant outgrows its pot and gets plunked into the yard, and then it spreads by rhizomes like wildfire. Any part of the plant will root, by the way. So even if you went and let's say you were pruning it back, if you by accident left a piece of any of the plant, a piece of the root, a piece of the leaf behind, that will root and it will be coming back on you again. So that's what makes this particularly tough. So alternatives to bowstring hemp is the native Kunti, the Zamia floridana in Central and South Florida. Kuntis can be tricky. They are cycads, so they have a taproot that is quite sensitive to transplantation. But if they like the area they're in, they will do quite well and get quite big. They don't spread aggressively, but they are beautiful, kind of prehistoric look to them, similar to your bowstring hemp. There's another Central and South non-native species might be the African spear, which is a Dracaena, also that's Sansevieria cylindrica. That it looks very similar to bowstring hemp, but it is it's a cylindrical look to the leaf. Also in Central and South Florida, another native would be the saw palmetto, Serenoa repens. And Serenoa repens does have a variety that is silver, which is what the picture shows here, and it is really stunning and underutilized, I have to say. Lastly, a non-native in the cycad type family is the ZZ plant, Zamia Cocos, probably only in South Florida, however. All right, lantana. Oof. So lantana used to be called Lantana camera. It has now been reclassified or renamed as Lantana strigocamera. Never mind, it is invasive in North, Central, and South Florida. FLEPSI calls it a Cat 1 throughout the state. So it is really considered, you know, highly invasive. It is native to Central and South America. It is wildly popular because it tolerates heat, drought, salt, all sorts of things. But it really quickly spreads into disturbed sites, and it is toxic to wildlife. So there is a native lantana. In fact, there are 3 native lantanas in Florida. The most widely available is probably the Lantana involucrata, this beautiful little, it's called button sage or wild sage. It's not as showy as your Lantana strigocamera, but it has a really pretty little blossom. It is loved by pollinators and widely available, I should say, at native plant nurseries. You have to be kind of careful of buying native lantanas because sometimes they have cross-pollinated with the camera, and you might have something on your hands that you don't really want. Another good native alternative to lantana is the butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, and this is one of the native, I should say, butterfly plants or Asclepiases. I do want to point out here that it's worth mentioning that the tropical or scarlet milkweed, which is Asclepias curasivica, is a non-native, and it is on the caution plant. It's on the caution plant list for South Florida. And we really encourage people not to plant the tropical or scarlet milkweed because of issues, disease issues with monarchs. So you really want to try to go with native milkweeds wherever possible. There's more to the lantana story, however. Luckily, we've got some more options. There are sterile cultivars that have been developed. These produce no fruits or seeds. And so that puts more energy into the production of flowers, which is a good thing. Now, the University of Florida assessment lists these T2, T3, T4, and T9 as not a problem species. I do not know if they have common names, and I really could not find a lot of information about those plants. But there are some additional cultivars that I do know a little bit more about. There is the University of Florida has produced 3 cultivars: Bloomify Red, Bloomify Rose, and Luscious Royal Red Zone. And those are the 3 plants you see from left to right on the bottom of the screen there. These are not a problem species. They've been developed over the last 16 years by Dr. Deng. You see a picture of him here and his team at the University of Florida Gulf Coast Education and Research Center in Waimama. And again, no fruit and no seeds. They will not hybridize with native lantanas, which is a good thing. And they're all considered safe, but they're all still toxic to animals. Okay. Oof. Nandina, heavily bamboo. It's not really bamboo. Nandina domestica, invasive north central and south Florida, a Cat 1 on the FLEPC list in north and central Florida. Native to Asia. It is valued because it is drought tolerant. I used to live in Texas, and I remember they loved Nandina because it's drought resistance. But it now is considered invasive there, and Florida, and Tennessee, and North Carolina, and Georgia. This plant spreads by rhizomes. In colder areas, I would say, of the state, it's considered semi-deciduous. It's kind of a zone 6 to 9 species. Can take full or part sun. There are numerous cultivars out there. So if you're buying Nandina domestica, take care of make sure you know what you're buying. So basically, let's do a substitute instead, okay? In north and central Florida, the native Simpson stopper, Myrcianthes fragrans. Similar cultural conditions, beautiful little white blossoms, great pollinator plant. In my yard, the raccoons love those berries, which is a double-edged sword. We won't go there. Also in north and central Florida, a non-native substitute might be the firepower Nandina. Now that's one of those cultivars that we were talking about earlier. It is Nandina domestica, but the cultivar is firepower. So if you want to get a Nandina, your heart's set on it, this is a safe cultivar to buy. In South Florida, the white indigo berry, Randia aculeata, is a good substitute. This has a really pretty white blossom that it puts on a berry. Beautiful glossy leaf, very drought tolerant, a beautiful habit of growth. Get rid of that heavenly bamboo and put in this instead. Another cultivar of the domestica, the Nandina domestica, that is safe for South Florida is the harbor dwarf. So just make sure if you're buying one of these Nandina domesticas, you're getting a safe cultivar. All right, I promised to give you a tale of the Realia simplex. This is Mexican petunia. It is invasive, no uses under any circumstances, north, central, and south Florida. FLEPC shares that sentiment, category 1 throughout the state. This is a native of Mexico, obviously, also the Caribbean, parts of South America, very popular in home landscapes, tolerates sun, shade, wet, dry, poor soil. It's a prolific bloomer. It blooms pretty much all year and produces a prolific amount of seeds, also spreads by rhizomes and pieces of root. So this has led to the development of a number of sterile cultivars that do not produce seeds. So it's so popular, people are wanting this plant, but they are conscious of the fact that it's invasive. So there have been some sterile cultivars. Purple showers, which is the picture on your far left is probably the most readily available, I would say, in retail, in sort of retail garden centers and wholesale nurseries. Then there's another group, the Aztec pink, pink white, and Aztec purple. That's another series of sterile cultivars. The Mayan series. These are pictures here in the middle and to your right of the Mayan series. These were also produced in Dr. Deng's laboratory here at the University of Florida. So you have Mayan pink, Mayan purple, Mayan white, Mayan compact. They're just beautiful. But these are still, even though they're sterile, they're still considered caution by the assessment because they will spread by rhizomes. Okay. In fact, we have a master gardener who his wife insisted on having a Mexican petunia, and he told her, no, 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 you want to get a safe cultivar, but you're still going to be married to it. And so they did put in one of these quote unquote, you know, safe cultivars, and it is, you know, you do have to put in an effort to keep it under control from spreading to places where you don't want it. So that's the Real Simplex story. King's Mantle, by the way, is also another good substitute for it. But anyway, if you are looking for getting the whole Ruellia story, well, in terms of non-natives, I should say, in North Central and South Florida, we do have a native Ruellia. That's Ruellia caroliensis. It is called wild petunia or wild Carolina petunia. Not quite as showy as simplex, but it's native and it is readily available in native plant nurseries. Also, a native alternative is the blue porterweed, Strachytarfetta javaciensis. Now, there are two other Strachytarfettas that are not natives, so you have to be quite careful when you're buying anything that's called porterweed. You want to make sure you get the native, which is a more of a prostrate habit of growth, a thinner leaf. The other two species I'm talking about one can get quite tall. They both have wider leaves, and they are not the native. You want definitely to get the native here. Other alternatives that are non-natives for Mexican petunia would be Plectranthus. That includes like the Mona lavender, which likes shadier conditions. Plumbago is another beautiful shrub that puts on kind of this lavendery purple flower. Another alternative would be bougainvillea, only in Central and South Florida, of course. Bougainvillea comes in a number of different of colors. Good alternative. If you're looking for color in your landscape, which when people put in Mexican petunia, that's what they want. You know, any one of these is a good alternative. So our last species today, good, we're getting right close to our time here, is the oyster plant, Tradescantia spathacea, invasive, no uses in South Florida, Cat 1 in Central and South on the Flepsy list. This plant has a lot of names, both common and scientific names. It's got lots of relatives. It's a ground cover that spreads by rhizomes. It will root from any part of the plant. So you really don't want to, it is risky if you put anything in this with this look. There's something called Purple Queen. There's something called Wandering Jew. There's a number of different, you know, common names. Like I said, if you want to kind of avoid the whole pitfall of it all, you could select things like the native Kunti, again, Zamia floridana. You could select Elliott's Lovegrass, which is a beautiful native. Eragrostis elliotti has sort of a lavender on one side of the leaf, a kind of a blue on the other side of the leaf, and they're both beautiful. The Tradescantia pallid, the Purple Queen, that is a safe non-native to put in. And then Mondo grass is another non-native that is safe to put in place of the oyster plant. Now, just real quick, I want to look at, we've been looking at things that have been classified as invasive or caution on the assessment. The assessment also has the predictive tool, which we talked about last week, which classifies things as high invasion risk, which means that these are species that have not escaped cultivation yet, but they would be at risk for escaping cultivation and becoming invasive. So two of these that you might not be aware of, and many of you have these in your landscape, yellow alamanda, Alamanda cathartica, is classified as a high invasion risk throughout Florida, as is the calico flower. Aristolochia elegans, used to be called Aristolochia littoralis, a favorite in our yards for butterflies. But now those are both considered high invasion risk by the university's assessment. Two other high invasion risk plants are the Christmas cassia, the Senapendula, the varieties glabrata, and then pampas grass, Cordaria celoana. So these are 4 species that you might not be aware of that are now considered high invasion risk, which is red light means don't plant them. So that does it for me today. Next week, we're going to talk about taking control of invasives, and we're going to discuss biological controls, mechanical controls, including herbicides. And then we're going to just talk a little bit about places where you might go to get some financial assistance if you're in a community or HOA, and things that impact homeowners associations when it comes to invasives and who's responsible for removal, et cetera, et cetera. So that's it for me. So let me close that. Stop share.
Thank you so much, Amy. We had a lot of good questions in the Q&A. Most of them I was able to answer related to the species you were talking about directly. I did want to save this question till the end. It's more of a general question asking about the fact that nurseries can sell invasives. What are the requirements on them to have some kind of notification of their invasive status, or what are the rules surrounding nurseries and invasives?
Well, yes, good point. I mean, it's really frustrating when you go to, for example, not just nurseries, but big box stores, and you're well aware that Mexican Petunia Ruellia simplex is an invasive and they're selling it. Because big box stores, they're nationwide. They take their plant lists. They're decided on a nationwide level. They don't take into consideration necessarily local issues or even statewide issues. Nurseries, same thing goes with nurseries. The only regulation are those prohibited species. So that's the only place where there are teeth in it. And really, nurseries have no obligation to inform you that you're buying something that the University of Florida classifies as invasive. Because let's keep in mind that these are non-regulatory classifications, FLEPC as well. They are not, there's no statute, I guess, that has gone into place against these. So it's let the buyer beware.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Yeah, and the agency responsible for monitoring what nurseries sell in the state of Florida is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and they will monitor occasionally and answer complaints regarding particular nurseries or plant sellers. So if you notice that there's something that is on that prohibited list that you've seen somewhere, they will go and investigate and hold those places accountable. Unfortunately, though, as Amy said, there's no regulatory teeth associated with these classifications according to FLEPC or IFAS. So these classifications are not associated with any kind of regulation. It's just based on science. Let's see, we've got 2. Pigeon plum, question about pigeon plum. I think, Nancy, if you have a question specifically, if you would go ahead and send an email to manateemg@gmail.com, and I can put that in the chat box. That way we can address anything specifically you have to ask regarding pigeon plum. And then, let's see, next week, so next week's presentation, do you plan to talk about some invasives that invade your yard that are not planted on purpose? So things that might be creeping over your fence that you did not put there.
Yes, indeed. We will be addressing that, specifically things like Brazilian pepper and, of course, air potato vine.
Okay, great. I can... yeah, if you joined us a little bit later, you may not be able to see the link for the registration in the chat box. Let me go ahead and put that in there again before we leave for today. That way you all have access to it so that you can join us next week. Let's see here. Let me get that in the chat for you all. Okay, there you go. So I just put the link to the registration for next week's webinar in the chat box so you have access to it. Please do also check out our YouTube channel. As I said earlier, we recorded this webinar, and at the conclusion of this series, we'll be posting all three as a playlist on YouTube, and so you'll be able to view it there. This webinar is set up as an on-demand webinar, so my understanding from the attendees' perspective is that you should be able to, once the webinar concludes, wait a couple hours, you should be able to click on the link that you use to access the webinar and have access then to the recording if you have already registered for the webinar today. And with that, we will go ahead and conclude today. And thank you so much, Amy. Great presentation.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.